Hello, this is the Vapes4Vets podcast brought to you by Namaste Technologies. I'm here today with Sean Kiernan. How are you doing today, Sean?
Good, Jesse. Thank you for having me.
Not a problem. Where are you calling from?
Right now, I am in Las Vegas, Nevada.
Wow, how's the weather down there?
It is hot, hot, hot. I mean, when it's 98 or 99 and it's a cool day, you are in Vegas.
I've never been, plan to go soon. So Sean, you're the one of the founders of the project Weed for Warriors. What's that all about?
Yeah, no, I am the current president. Kevin Richardson, a Marine out of San Jose, was the founder in 2014. And Mark Carrillo is our current COO. And we're a group of veterans who, through our own life experiences, found that the pharmaceutical approach being, championed by not only the Veterans Administration, but hospitals in general and pharmaceutical companies, the pharmaceutical approach not only didn't work, but for many of us, it had a very adverse effect. And those effects, as stated on the warning labels, are real. And those include death and suicide and addiction and a host of other very dangerous side effects to our body.
Yeah, suicide's a big one. I was talking with Patrick Seifert multiple times, and I can't believe that the average veterans we lose a day is 22 to suicide.
Correct. And 22 was the number from, I believe it was the 2011 or 12 study. The VA said, well, it's not that high. It's only 20 in 2000, off their 2014 study that just came out. I think it was 2014 or 15. So 2022, it's the best number we have, and it's still not accurate, and we believe it's higher.
Sorry, they say 20 is not that high compared to 22. Like 20,
Well, I think
20 a
they
day is.
have to round down. I think the official is still too high. One's too high. But yes, they, with much fanfare, said, well, that's not the right number. It's only 20. So, but then, we must point out that the numbers aren't always accurate. And what do I mean by that? And for example, we've had many instances where, coroners are very hesitant to put suicide on a death certificate. So was the gentleman who was driving 100 miles an hour into a side of a concrete wall, was that a car accident or was that suicide? And so those are the things that go unreported, that we don't hear about. So we believe the number's higher, but whether it's 20, 22, what we do know is this: we're losing at a minimum 15,000 veterans a year. That's 41 a day if you include opiate overdoses and benzo overdoses. So just those two pharmaceuticals that are very much pushed by the VA gets you to 41 veterans a day who are either committing suicide, who are overdosing on opiates, or they're overdosing on benzos. And so just those three categories alone, meaning two early deaths that are unnecessary, 41 veterans a day. And all three of those, we believe, can be laid at the front doorstep of the pharmaceutical industry.
And these aren't just combat vets, correct?
It's all type of vets, and it's veterans are significantly higher rate of suicide than the average population, and also on the opiate side, they're twice as likely to die from opiate overdoses than the average population. So, the combat vet moniker that we've thrown around here, again, I served from 89 to 93, and to 93 in Central America. I was an airborne infantry soldier. We have a bunch of vets who maybe didn't serve in a combat zone, like Panama during the invasion, or other in Iraq in the first war, the second war, that in the 90s and 2000s. But what we do have is a lot of veterans who are being treated by the VA with a prescription of pharmaceuticals that we believe is one of the main reasons behind the increased rate of suicide, the increased rate of addiction, overdoses, and again, that can be placed at the front doorstep of the VA and in our healthcare system in general. And I don't think that has anything to do with being a combat vet or not being a combat vet, whatever that means.
And you're working with veterans all over the country. Like you have over a dozen chapters across the United States.
Yeah, we actually have 18 chapters, and it's growing. We're just going to launch, I think, 4 in June. Miami being the first one that's going to open up here. Yeah, we have chapters throughout the United States. Their mission is to kind of be on the front lines to try to be a support network for veterans in the community. And what we require for those veterans to do is hold a meeting. So each chapter you can find on our website at wfwproject.org. And those chapters were predominantly have been in California, but we have chapters in New Jersey. We have chapters in DC, Maryland, Virginia. We have chapters in Florida, Tennessee, Wisconsin. So we're expanding in Denver. We're expanding throughout the country. And every month these chapters meet, and where they can, they distribute cannabis, and where they can't, it's like-minded individuals getting together to help each other in any way they can.
And I read an article on your organization. Title was "Weed for Warriors Project says medical marijuana can save vets' lives." Are you talking mostly about suicide there, or what are we?
No. I mean, let's just take the numbers we have. And again, we all know the research is a little bit of propaganda from the drug war to very limited data that we have out there on the positive effects of cannabis. But to give you an example, let's take the 15,000 veterans we know, and that's conservative because we're only counting benzoids at the same rate as the civilian population, and suicides and opiates are higher than the civilian population. So we are only baselining it at the same. So if we take those 15,000 veterans who are dying each year, what we do is we do have studies and statistical analysis of states and locations where cannabis is not only much more socially acceptable, but available, accessible to individuals. And in those states, what we see is both not only a decrease in overdoses, that I think a lot of people have heard the 25% decrease study, but what we also saw was a decrease in the suicide rate. So if we take those decreases, and they're only 1, 2, 3 studies here or there, so they're limited. But if we take those numbers and apply that to the 15,000 veterans dying each year, we would save approximately 2,500 to 3,000 veterans each year by having cannabis accessible. And I think it would be higher because, again, these studies are based on a very limited accessible market that we see in the U.S. But if it was more available legally and more socially acceptable, more veterans and non-veterans would choose cannabis. And what we did see in these studies was the more it was accessible, the higher the rate of lives being saved was. So 2,500 to 3,000 lives being saved a year, those are real numbers. So what we see here is a prescription, cannabis, saving lives. And what we see under the VA model is their opiates, their mood stabilizers, their benzoids, those things are killing us. We know these. It's not ifs, ands, or buts. They're killing us. And for a lot, it doesn't mean they don't work for some people, but they do not work for a lot of us. And all we're saying is we should have the choice, especially when you look at the risk profile. If I line up the risk profile as stated by the FDA of what the side effects are of the medications they are legally prescribing us, it is a whole host of very bad side effects, including death. If I can replace those 15 to 30 pills that I'm taking a day with cannabis alone, where the side effects is eating a bag of Doritos and falling asleep, that's a no-brainer in our opinion. And then you add on the fact that not only are we not, therefore, making the problem worse for a lot of people, what we're doing is actually now lowering the life loss. And take that number. Since Sue Sisley's study, the professor out of the University of Arizona who's canned, who's doing the study with maps on cannabis and PTSD treatment-resistant vets, we're talking about, since her study was approved in 2011 and it's just on her way, saving 65,000 veterans. And to me, that is disgusting that for politics, for morality, and for the propaganda benefit of a few, the dollars and cents of the pharmaceutical companies and the prohibition complex, we are hanging out our veterans to die and leaving them, alone in their time of need. And to me, that's just unacceptable.
And I've heard Dr. Sue Sisley has actually had some problems getting her research done, like getting not high quality marijuana being shut down. Have you heard anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, we've been on the front lines with her on that. Her study has been blockaded. Her study has been undermined. Her study has been continued to this day. They're trying to destroy it. And we see that through the government. We see that through the prohibition complex. And the NIDA cannabis is just one of it. You have active denial of the study, and then you have the systemic blockades that she's dealt with. And the quality of the cannabis is just one example of what's really wrong in this country and how we look at medicine and how we look at these health issues that for all due respect are bordering on crisis level. And for that reason, I think when you look at the issue, the LGBT community out there had it right in the 80s when they attacked the HIV and AIDS epidemic and the denial of many of these drugs in places like Europe that had been approved because they hadn't gone through our FDA process. They took the system on and won and got access to these medicines and for compassionate use. And I think it's about time that we as a country say, we understand not everyone's a fan of cannabis. And we also understand a lot of that hatred goes to the racist underlines of the drug market, the drug war that took place over the past, 30 plus 40 years. And so I don't care what you think of it. We cannot, it's a moral and human right to give someone who's sick and dying access to a medicine that, for all intents and purposes, is less adverse than the medicines we're giving them and saving lives in many cases.
Now, you've been working with veterans and medical cannabis for a long time. Have you noticed any negative effects from medical cannabis for treatment?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so to me it doesn't heal, it begins the process and allows the reintegration of somebody who has been taken out of society from the perspective of just a normalized person and being able to socialize, and they get isolated. And what that cannabis does is allow them to get reintegrated into society in a way that allows them to start the healing. So I think, like all things, how it's used, what you're using it for, the side effects are real. I mean, it can make you sleepy. It can cause weight gain. Some people say it causes weight loss. So there are side effects to it, but are there any negatives? The biggest negative to cannabis use in this country is the social and legal stigma of cannabis use. That's the biggest dangers to the veterans who are using it.
And like, would you say a big problem with veteran suicide are among those who don't talk about the PTSD they have or aren't diagnosed with it, and it just builds up to a point where they just can't handle it anymore?
Yeah, I think to your point, the suicide, you become isolated, and when you become isolated, you start to spiral out of control. And I think that our inability as a country to have an honest conversation about so many things that are rooted in morality or our long deep history of a very religious country, like sexuality in teenagers. How people say, well, just teach that, just say no. Well, it just doesn't work. And so when you create public policy that is based on something that is not doesn't work, you actually exacerbate the problems because you prevent the help getting to the people who are in need, because you've created a narrative that is just false and basically a myth. And that is, at the end of the day, medicines and people who can and want to help are many times prevented from helping because that person is in a state that not only doesn't allow it, but is very punitive when something like cannabis is used. For example, in Oklahoma or any place in the South, for the most part, these are states that take a very punitive approach to not only cannabis but all drugs. And given that punitive approach, you now are preventing help from getting to the veteran or non-veteran who's in need of it. So we have public policy in this country that not only doesn't help, it exacerbates the problem in so many ways.
Are any of your chapters located in states where recreational and or medical cannabis isn't legal?
Absolutely. For example, I mean, we have Virginia. We have a new chapter opening up in Alabama. And again, legal is a word that I don't know is very accurate in many cases. And what I mean by that is we have places like Georgia that, quote, has a legalized medical cannabis program. And we see this in places like New York. If you look at the bodies who are signing up and using these medical cannabis programs, it's very low. So what has happened is they've made these cannabis programs so restrictive. They've made these cannabis programs so ineffectual in their ability to get medicine to those people who need it. And so many barriers to climb, and so many hurdles to jump, and so many chasms to avoid, that no one's using it. And so, therefore, that gets to the point. What we've seen in the studies is where cannabis is most acceptable and most legal, you have the highest degree of saving lives relative to those places that either have a restrictive cannabis program, so it's legal in name only, or it's illegal. So again, I think where a lot of my peers who want to spin the positive side of what's going on, and that's we have, the majority of states now have legalized marijuana. The fact is the majority don't have a pragmatic working, model yet. And you just have to look at Florida to see what's really going on. It's not just that the ballot booth were blocked, but once it gets beyond the ballot booth, we're blocked. And like Florida, where the politicians then delay it and they gum up the works to get something done. And so what comes out of it is a very restrictive program that no one's going to use, but the politicians can then take the heat off them and say, oh, well, we have a legalized cannabis program. And so I think when we talk about legal cannabis, we need to make sure we understand is we have a very, even in states where it's legal, California, for example, with AMU, Prop 64 and McCursa that just came law, it's so restrictive. The reality is most veterans are going to continue to medicate on the black market and not access the legal market, unfortunately, because of its expense in acquiring those meds and also the hurdles and being so regulated.
And what is the process for a veteran or someone who needs medical cannabis in a state that they don't have medical cannabis?
Oh, it varies state by state, but what you're talking about in many cases is a trip to a doctor, in many cases multiple doctors that the veteran has to pay for themselves because they're not covered under the VA. So you're talking about hundreds of dollars for those visits. You're talking about an application process that is very burdensome, and in many cases is another couple, $300. In many cases, you have to reapply for that, license to use cannabis yearly, if not, multiple times within a year, costing multiple $100. So again, that your question goes to the exact issue that we're seeing, that even in states with a legalized cannabis program, costs are so prohibitive, not only in the ability to get a license, but then to medicate oneself through the legalized dispensary process, where you're paying not only rates higher than you would find on the black market, but you're also paying taxes in many cases that add, 20, 30, or 40% in some cases to the cost of that bill.
And they're not reimbursed at all for any of this?
Nah, no one reimburses that. It's pure cash out of a disabled veteran's pocket. So if we have, for example, 100% disabled vet, meaning the VA has said this vet is 100% disabled. So he's not going to find a job. He's disabled. They give him $2,900 and some odd dollars a month. That is not a lot of money for an injured vet to live on, to function, to rent a place, to pay his bills. And then on top of that, pay this, which quite frankly for many of these veterans is thousands of dollars a month through a dispensary program given the expense.
Okay, and I want to talk about Weed for Warriors. What are some upcoming events? What are some latest events that you like to bring up?
Yeah, so besides our monthly chapters that we have, we're going to be we tend to be represented at a lot of the events going on. It's like the cannabis conference in Florida this weekend we were at. We had our Florida chapters there representing themselves. So when you're at these events and you see us, please say hi, stop by the booth, get information. We are in the process of, we're saving bodies. I mean, if you talk about events, our biggest events are monthly meetings. And that's what I would encourage. They're open to the public to come in and not only show their support, but learn not only about what we're doing, but learn from the veterans themselves about what they're going through and what their needs are. Because we're throwing a lot of money at this problem, but in many cases, it's a lot of it's just for show, and it's not getting to the veterans. So I encourage anyone out there to go on our website, contact, the chapters in their area if they have one, and come out or bring a veteran and sit with the veteran through the meeting and see what these veterans get from these meetings, which goes way beyond cannabis. I mean, we have veterans that were on death's door, to be very honest with you, on Skid Row, and they've come to the meeting, and the cannabis helped them, but the real help came from their brothers and sisters, that camaraderie that these guys had missed, or these ladies had missed from the military, and to realize not only they're not alone, but their struggle is shared by so many, and that's a very empowering thing, and allows them to destigmatize themselves in their own mind that they're not bad people. There's nothing wrong with them, and then with that mutual support they find in these groups, they really make some real life changes that brings a lot of good to a lot of people. And so if you ask me what events we're at, I would say, you know what? Contact our meetings, come out and see, learn from the veterans themselves. Don't take our word for it. Don't take the media's word for it. Just come out, spend the time with some veterans, and not only probably learn a lot, but who knows, you might make some good friends.
And do you ever have people approaching you who have PTSD but may not be veterans?
Absolutely. It's really important that I say this, and I always say this, is Weed for Warriors exists because we're a bunch of veterans, because we have to. We have to help each other because the government's not helping us and the people aren't helping us. And that's not because I don't think they want to. I just don't think they know how, to be very honest with you. The people. I don't think the government, that's a different story animal we can go into. But it's really important that not only do veterans suffer from PTSD, think about their family members. Think about the children. Think, if you look at the children's rate of PTSD veterans from suicide when they get older, it's much higher. And if you look at what we have in this military, in this country, we're losing 15,000 vets to overdoses and suicides a year. We're losing 100,000. In 2015, it was a little less than 100,000 identifiable deaths from suicide and overdose. This is about half. And that was probably in 2016 and 17, the New York Times just posted an article that the numbers are accelerating even faster. So we're probably well over 100,000. So it's important to know that even though we're a veterans organization, we're fighting for everybody, from that child autistic child who needs to use cannabis, to the mother who lost her son in war, to the sexual assault survivor, to the abuse survivor, whether that be a guy or a girl, whether it be a child or an adult. These are all PTSD events that exist in all of us, not just veterans. So while veterans may have a higher propensity to suffer from these events and die likely of it, it's not limited to veterans. And again, I think the one thing needs to be brought up: what's the common thread amongst all this? If you overlay the suicide and overdose epidemic with the pharmaceutical acceptance and pushing of the pharmaceutical industry, they match beautifully. I'm going to say that my number one suspicion for why our suicide and overdose rate is off the charts is because we are giving out pharmaceuticals as candy, and the doctors and medical community are incentivized perversely to get on board with that. And the capital markets have done what capital markets are great at doing, and that's extracting money for the benefit of the few, and even at a tremendous cost to all of us. And that needs to be addressed. And until that's addressed, nothing's going to change. And the problem with addressing it, the pharmaceutical companies made over $1 trillion last year, over $100 billion in profit. So even though these people will say, well, the cannabis community, we're going to pay taxes, and we're going to make Colorado $250 million, and we're going to make California a couple billion in tax revenue, all that pales in comparison to what the prohibition complex is making, and therefore able to contribute to the political coffers of those who are charged with our policies and leading us.
Do you have veterans coming to you who suffer from other things like chronic pain?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important that we don't use, we have veterans, we have amputee veterans, we have veterans who have no legs or have no legs in one arm. We have veterans who have severe back problems, were in helicopter accidents, were shot, who were using opiates as pain relievers, and now they use cannabis alone. So it's really important. We are not limited to PTSD at all. Although I think PTSD is unique because you are supplementing cannabis for the psychotropes and psychological medicines that, opiates are one animal in the addiction issue. The psychotropes, the SSRIs, the anti-anxiety meds, all those meds that are also given on top of the painkillers, they deal with the psychiatric issues, the PTSD. And so while the opiates kill for a very obvious reason, the benzoids kill for a very obvious reason, what's not so obvious is why we're seeing a severe increase in suicide amongst those being prescribed these meds. And the pharmaceutical industry is actively trying to prevent the science to look into that. They're actively trying to prevent the science to show cannabis works. They're actively trying to prevent even the spotlight to be shedded on it. I say that, I always say cannabis, the people denying cannabis as medicine are, in my opinion, this decade, the new climate deniers. The money is so big in the current prohibition complex that just like the oil companies have their scientists who will say anything they want, so do the pharmaceutical companies. So does the government. Unfortunately, when we look at who they have on their payroll, it's hospitals like Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins Psychiatric Department, which is one of the premier research institutions in this world, is almost exclusively financed by NIDA, the government agency in charge of telling us how bad cannabis is. So you have a systemic issue in this country, which is, I call regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is nothing more than an economic theory, just like supply and demand, that is basically when a regulatory agency like the FDA is set up for the public good, but yet is captured by the industry. And then it sets up rules and regulations that not only benefit really the industry, meaning they create barriers of interest. They make it harder for competitors to exist. They make it harder for people to even have the freedom of choice. And that's exactly what is happening here in the medical community in the United States. And that is, the pharmaceutical industry is so in bed with everybody from the medical schools, that first-year doctor student, to the psychiatrist whose whole job exists for doling out these pain meds, these psych meds, excuse me. You have this kind of, I call it an axis of evil, if we want to be honest with you. And if you look at the deaths, if we're losing 100,000 people a year, and we can attribute some, if not a lot of that, to these these pharmaceuticals, at what point do these people who are preventing the free markets from actually working, who are preventing competition from having its fair day to choose? When we see in elderly people where cannabis is legal, they choose cannabis over many of the pharmaceuticals they're being given, and the Medicare receipts prove that. They don't want freedom of choice. They don't want the consumer to have a choice. They want the consumer to be tied into their way of giving medicine, their solution, and the problem is their solution is killing a lot of people, and we don't have a choice to get out of that, and that is what's wrong.
You said we lose 100,000 people. That's not just veterans, correct? That's
correct. So that number is 2015. When I say we lose 15,000 veterans, I'm looking at a year. I'm looking at the CDC puts out numbers every year. The last year they put them out was 2015. They'll come out soon. 2015. They'll come out soon with 2016, and it was like high 40,000 suicides, like 47 or 48,000 suicides, a similar number of overdoses. So you're right under 100,000. That was 2015. But now, if you look at the New York Times, put out an article, and there's a few other articles out in the past few weeks about about the overdose and suicide rates, they're growing dramatically even in 2015 and 16 and into 2017. So the growth rate that we were on, let alone that growth rate got higher in 2016, puts us well above losing 100,000 of our citizens to an early death. And Chris Cornell's wife just came out. He committed suicide, and she attributed it to him acting funny after he'd been put on some anti-anxiety meds. And that's a story we hear day after day, week after week, month after month throughout this country. And so we look at those numbers. What we're saying is, okay, if the study that came out said a 25% increase in overdoses, you have 50,000 overdoses. That's 12,500 people you're saving right there each year. Then if the suicide statistics show out that in states like California, where cannabis is legal, that the suicide rate is lower, 10 to 11%, then that's 5,000 to 6,000 people. So right there, you're saving 16, 17, 18,000 people a year by giving people the choice to have access to cannabis. Now, the question is, well, when we saw in these studies is in those states that had a lower social stigma and access was easier, that number was actually higher than a state that had legal cannabis but access maybe wasn't so easy. So it's very easy to make the jump and say, then if cannabis was 100% socially acceptable and a freedom for anyone to choose, that a lot more people would be choosing cannabis than they do even today in legal states. And if those numbers hold out, we'd be saving a lot more people. And what's important about that is think about that. For your Christmas, your Hanukkah, your Kwanzaa, your Easter, your any of your holidays, July 4th, that dead brother, that dead sister, that dead cousin, that dead mother, that dead father would be at the dinner table with their children and family and their friends. And so why are we not allowing this? And we're not allowing this because prohibition has been entrenched since the 70s. Anti-cannabis attitudes that were based purely on racism by people wanting to make a lot of money off those views are preventing people from not only having the ability to choose cannabis, but the willingness to choose cannabis. And that's sad, especially when cannabis is a lot less dangerous than any of these pharmaceuticals being pumped down our throat.
On top of cannabis, do you and your organization, do you recommend other methods of dealing with symptoms? Maybe not anything to do with medication, but just on top of using cannabis, what else?
Absolutely, absolutely. I don't think there's, what I say is, listen, antibiotics work. We know vets who do still take antidepressants, who do take some mood stabilizers, and they swear by them. And so therefore we want to make it very clear. We're not talking about cannabis being a mandatory substitute like the pharmaceutical industry has made their solution, that you can only use pharmaceuticals. What we're saying is, and they say, even everyone, doctors say this, when you go to a doctor, we got to find the right cocktail for you. It's called the combat cocktail. It could be this lithium, or it could be this, or it could be 29 different varieties. And then if you're taking 30 pills, it ends up being 10,000 different varieties. And you have to find what works for you. What I can tell you, I think it's much the same. I think cannabis works, but is it mutually exclusive? Doesn't have to be. Do we support your choice? Absolutely. Do we have people at our meetings do a lot more than just smoke cannabis? Absolutely. We have massages. We have meditation. We have events. We have team building. We do a lot more than just cannabis because I think we believe cannabis is an aid. It's not the only solution.
And how many members would you say you currently have?
Well, right now we have 18 chapters. Our average chapter meeting is about 60 to 70 a month. Some chapters, like Sacramento, potentially being a lot bigger. They have 300 people on their records who come, but anywhere from 60 to 150 a month. So in general, I would say we're bringing out probably about a little less than 1,000 vets each month to our meetings throughout the country who are therefore choosing and actively advocating for cannabis over the pharmaceutical approach. I mean, if the traditional measurements that people like to use, we're followed by 50,000 organic followers on Facebook. We have 26,000 on Instagram. We reach millions of people each week via our website, wfwproject.org. And so on one sense, we're on the front lines with our chapters, but on the national level, we're about raising awareness, and not only raising awareness, but being a critic of society, and to point out areas where we think society is doing some stuff wrong by its veterans. And I think that's our goal. And if we can raise that awareness and save lives and help bodies, we're happy. But it's not enough. We need a lot more help.
And which states are you expanding into?
Right now, I think Alabama, we're starting. Florida, we're really jumping. We are going to, 2 months ago or 3 months ago, we only had Tampa. Now we have North Florida. Miami's launching. We are in Tennessee. We're launching in Alabama. We're in our D.C., Maryland, Virginia chapter. It's pretty new. It's not new, but it's you're talking 3 or 4 months old. Our New Jersey chapter is 3 or 4 months old. We're going to start a New York City chapter here. So I will say in states where it is illegal, our chapters tend to take a much lower profile at the chapter level. So they might be a little bit more difficult. So go on our page, you'll see the active chapters. And where there's not an active chapter, I would encourage anyone to get in touch via the email to Mark Crillo. He's our chapter kind of president, COO. And we tell him, you listen, we need help. And if you want to start a chapter in your area, this is what we require. You got to be a functioning adult. It's going to be a lot more difficult than you think it is. So don't go into it, blindly. But it's very rewarding. And all I need you to do is get a meeting place once a month to bring these vets together. Because what we have found is we can prepare all we want, but unless we have leaders on the ground in the area and veterans in the area who are willing to get involved, it doesn't work. So once we get those veterans who want to be involved and want to help, a tremendous amount of magic happens. And that magic, while the cannabis may be kind of the drawing point, the reality is when these veterans meet other veterans that have been through the same stories they have, a tremendous weight is lifted off their shoulders, and they're not stigmatized in their own minds anymore. And more importantly, when those mothers and fathers or those wives or husbands or those children, we have events we invite the children to, and they come and they see fellow children and fellow spouses who have gone through the heartaches that they've been through. That's when the magic happens, and that's when the friendships happen, and that's when the connections happen, and that's what we're seeing is what's truly healing our brothers and sisters. We as a country have so isolated our veterans to the right-hand corner because we're scared of them. We think they have problems, and no one wants to deal with them because there's no money in dealing with them. This country does really good things when there's money to be made. When there's no money to be made off the sick and suffering, they get ignored. And so these meetings have a lot more meaning than just cannabis.
And do you find you have a lot of support, like obviously to put on all these events, you need funding. Like, is there you have a lot of support on that front?
No, I hate to be the cynic, but no. I mean, the reality is the veteran cause has been championed by corporate America, mainly as an advertising gimmick by corporate America. So they look to help in the most mundane, vanilla ways, and because they don't want any controversy, so they avoid us like the plague. The government absolutely has been a blockade to real help. At some point, when the numbers don't lie. What you're doing, U.S. government, what you are doing, Veterans Administration, what you are doing, fellow Americans, is not working. It is not working. And so a lot of people, they give their $5 and they feel happy and they ignore the rest. And that's not going to help. We need people to be actively involved. We need people to stop being so politically correct. We need people to stop caring more about how it looks or is perceived than what's real, these guys suffering and these ladies suffering, and do what's right. I mean, we have a slogan at the project, and we didn't steal from Spike Lee, but I didn't recognize we started saying it. I was like, oh yeah, that's from Spike Lee. And it's unlike Nike, which is just do it, which represents so much of the success of America and the riches that it's gotten. But the consequences of just do it means there's a lot of collateral damage. Because if just do it is your moniker, then you really don't care about what the consequences are. Well, we care about the consequences, so it's just do the right thing. And it's very difficult for many people to just do the right thing, because in many cases, just do the right thing conflicts with the P&L of who they are as an individual or company, and or they are so scared because of the war on drugs and what it's done to this country's psyche and how it looks as drugs. They don't want to be associated with anything to do with cannabis, even if it's saving lives. And so if you ask me, do I think America or this government cares about us veterans? The hard reality is no, I don't. That's just the hard reality. So we work on a shoestring budget. A lot of us are disabled veterans making money monthly, so we're not doing this for the money. But you raise a good question, and that is, how do we finance this thing and take it to a next level? Because while we're helping vets, we need 8,000 chapters. We don't need 18. Or we need a lot of other groups stepping up, and they're coming out. They're doing some things. Some groups are doing some good things. And that is how do we finance this thing and take it to the next level? So we in California have been able to do it without much financing because the goodwill and generosity of some very good people. And when I say, do I think the country and the people care about its veterans, I say no. That doesn't mean all. There are good people out there. And what we found is the cannabis community under the old regime of kind of black market was very, very giving, from flower to extracts to all kinds of cannabis products that we were able to give out at our meetings. We're able to give out our meetings sometimes $4,000 or $5,000 a month in $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a month in cannabis products retail to these veterans to help subsidize them medicating because they can't afford to medicate if they had to go to the dispensary system. And so we're trying to figure out how to do this. And what MPP and DPA and those groups have pushed is very much a capitalist solution to this, which is we're going to highly regulate it and give the prohibition this tightly controlled market. And then as they see the taxes being made by the government and we treat it like alcohol, then more people will be okay with accessing cannabis and then allowing other people to access cannabis. Well, the problem with that is now you're building a lot of regulatory cost into the solution. You're building a lot of taxes into the solution, and you're building the profit motive into the solution, which does the one thing to cannabis, the medicine of these veterans, that they can't afford, and that's increased cost.
And if someone's living, a lot of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. If you all of a sudden need to start paying for something you need, that could lead to more problems.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So I am in Nevada right now. I have my Nevada rec card. I'm a little different than most. After my military experience, I went to Cal Berkeley, worked on Wall Street. I was able to make a little money, although by no means am I rich. And honestly, most of my money has been going over the past 6, 7 years for me dealing with my own issues and helping fight the fight. But yeah, you can. I mean, you're spending thousands of dollars a month at a minimum purchasing flower, purchasing extracts in the quantity and quality needed as medicine. And you cannot do it for these vets. And that's what our, we were against Prop 64 in California and many of these legal environments because we're saying it's legalized cannabis for the wealthy. It's legalized cannabis for the professional, the doctor, the lawyer, the reporter, the liberal trust fund kids who think, oh, great, we're fighting for legal cannabis. Yeah, you're fighting for legal cannabis for you, but you're not fighting legal cannabis for the poor, the sick, and the disabled. They're still going to be in the black market. And now what we're seeing in places like Colorado, they're still going to go after the black market because now the legal cannabis market and the prohibitionists have combined forces, and they're using tax dollars made under legalized cannabis in places like cannabis to go after the black market. And the black market is not only going to exist, but in many cases it's going to be bigger than it was before when you decriminalize the end user, which should be done. That's one of the benefits of legalization. The unfortunate thing is now what you're doing in this country is what we've always done in this country. The system works great for people who have money. The system doesn't exist for those people without money. And so the unfortunate thing in this legal cannabis approach, you're seeing that the poor, the sick are still under threat of arrest, are still under threat of incarceration, are still under threat of getting thrown into the system. And when you take these veterans and do that, you're signing a death warrant. So we are very fearful in places like California where Prop 64 and McCurza have allowed these counties to deny access to medicine either by restricting growing medicine or accessibility being a dispensary for medicine that existed under Prop 215. These counties are now allowed to ban it all out. And what we're seeing is in many counties, our veterans who could grow their medicine are no longer going to be able to grow it in California, and or they're going to have to, drive in some cases 100 miles to a legal dispensary. And that's just wrong. And so what we have here is this kind of movement to a legalized market. There's been a lot of give ups to the prohibitionists, and where the legal cannabis market gave stuff up was where it affects the poor. And that's what we see all the time, right? Because they don't have a voice. And one of the things Weed for Warriors is attempting to do, besides just educating, raising awareness, and getting access into the hands of those who need it, it's about giving the voice to the voiceless. And these disabled vets don't have money. And one thing is we know in this country, unless you have money, the government doesn't listen to you. Unless you have money, the media doesn't care because it's owned by the corporations who want to drive their agenda. And so our goal and hope is not only to raise awareness, not only to give access to cannabis, but to give voice to the voiceless. And that goes beyond just veterans. It goes on to anyone who's in a working class family or younger or poor, and they have family members who are sick and need access to those medicines. They need to be able to have access that are affordable and free of legal prosecution or stigma to get the best benefit out of cannabis.
Where I'm from in Canada, veterans they get reimbursed three grams a day of marijuana, and if their doctor prescribes it, they get up to $300 towards a
Correct.
vaporizer through Blue Cross. It's just
Well,
it's
and
like
this is the
night and
thing.
day.
if people realize we spent, I think the last purchase I looked at, one purchase of the VA was $3 billion. If you look at the pharmaceutical bill the VA pays, it's insane. We're talking, I think it's tens of billions of dollars a year. So when we look at that, and we look at that bill across the country, Canada's approach is the cheaper approach. It's the more economical approach. It's the rational approach. It's the smart approach. It's everything us little capitalists in business school were told was the right thing to do. Free markets allow people to innovate, allow people to choose. They'll make the rational decision. That's not what we allow here in this country, the land of capitalism, supposedly. And what we find out for those people who aren't educated enough, we're not the land of capitalism. We're the land of, fascism in many cases. And what's going on right now in our medical community is fascism. And that is, our choice is the right choice. You don't have a choice.
You know,
And I applaud what you guys are doing in Canada. I think it's absolutely awesome.
I was speaking with a couple different organizations up here in Canada, and they'll be throwing a decriminalization of recreational marijuana party. So you should make your way on up here and.
Oh, I'd love to. And you guys got. I have to say, I have a lot of friends and veterans in Canada, and it's really heartening. And I got to tell this to the Canadian people. For a lot of us veterans to see what your country has done for your veterans up there on the cannabis issue. While it sucks for us down here, it gives us hope. And so I want to give a big thank you to anyone who's listening up there for doing what you guys are doing and how you're doing it. And we can only hope that our government and our politicians see the errors of their way in time, and we stop losing the hundreds of thousands of people dying each year in this country. And that's just in this country. As you said, we have a lot of other countries in this world, and some are doing the right way, Canada being one of them. At least they're attempting to, and they're trying to figure it out. And we applaud you guys.
Yeah, I was completely unaware that our government was doing that until I started this campaign and spoke to veterans. And after hearing that, it's like night and day from yes, we get reimbursed and we get this towards a vaporizer. Then speaking to veterans in the States, it's no, we get nothing, and we got to pay for doctor's appointments to get medical marijuana. It's just
and that's just a
completely
barrier.
different.
Yeah, and that's a barrier to entry erected by the prohibition complex. They don't want to give us the choice. They don't want freedom of choice. They don't want freedom of will, and it denies, in my opinion, a very constitutional protection. We have the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All of that is denied under cannabis prohibition for
How
those people who need it.
how long have you been doing this, Sean? Like how long has Weed for Warriors been operational?
Weed for Warriors was founded in 2014, and it has been around by Kevin Richardson, San Jose Marine veteran. I came up and started working with Dr. Sue Sisley after my suicide attempt in 2011. And my involvement, I was spent some time for the first time at a VA hospital in 2013 since I left the military and saw firsthand what was going on. And that's when I dove head in and got in contact with Dr. Sisley and started working with her and many other veterans who had been working with her throughout the country and fighting for her study, because what we're told is, oh, there's no science out there. And we know that's wrong. There's a lot of science out there saying cannabis is effective, but no FDA science. Well, the reason there's no FDA science is because they blocked FDA science on the positive effects of cannabis. And so I got involved fighting for Dr. Sisley long before she was terminated at the University of Arizona. When she was terminated, it sent it to the stratosphere in terms of the national, and worldwide mind, share. And from there, we've been fighting. And it's not just been myself, but a ton of other veterans throughout this country, the Canadian veterans. We have a chapter in the United Kingdom. We have a chapter in Australia. What we're seeing is that in many countries like Canada and places like Israel, where they give their active duty soldiers cannabis, is that this isn't controversial in those places. This is, everyone gets it and it makes sense. But in this country, the propaganda is pushed so hard to protect the profits of those making money off prohibition that the people in the United States not only don't get to choose, but they're being so confused with the propaganda that there's not an honest discussion. And so, we have to give a big shout out to those countries outside the U.S. who are leading the way, and to those veterans in those countries who have been leading it for as long as we have. And we give a big standing ovation to those people in those countries.
Sean, what would be absolutely awesome, and of course, if you both are willing, is to have you and Dr. Sisley on the show and just to talk about your work together and the fight you had together.
That'd probably be a great idea, and maybe even have a few other veterans she's working with on who help her because I don't want to hog the spotlight with her. I was one on CNN Weeds 3 with her, and it's important that we get her on there and maybe get some other veterans on with you. And I'd love to come back anytime, and I will definitely extend that invitation to her. And if you want to set up a time, shoot me an email, and we'll see if she can make it because I can tell you, if there's a fighter in this world that I believe is going to fight the good fight and do the right thing, it's Dr. Sue Sisley. And she doesn't always agree with us, and we don't always agree with her. But I can tell you, in a country, the United States, where it's so hard to find people doing the right thing, and I'm not talking about the propaganda puff pieces put out by companies and people doing the right thing, which is nothing more than marketing. I'm talking about sacrificing their own future. I mean, this doctor, when faced with termination, stuck to her guns, stuck to her morals, and said, we need to do the science. And she lost her career almost over that. And so I think it would be wonderful for her to come on. And I guarantee you, if you gave her a platform to come on and speak about what she sees, which is the doctor's, view, not my view, maybe a little less passionate and a little bit more just objective, she would be a great person to have on air. And let's try to get that done.
All right, let's set it up. After we get out of
Okay.
here, I'll turn the recorder off and we can talk about it.
Awesome.
Um, Sean Kiernan, it's been absolutely great having you on the show.
Oh,
Anything else you want to say before we get out of here?
no, I just want to say thank you for people like yourself. As I said, the big media isn't telling an honest story about much. And it's people's like yourself and people throughout this world who are taking to the airways on social media, taking the airways, writing their own blogs, and doing these independent media sites on the internet that are really starting to allow alternative viewpoints to be out there. And that's so important because that's the weapon we have against the monopolies. That's the weapon we have against these vertically integrated monopolies. And by that, I mean not only the for-profit centers, but by the media centers that are controlled by them who decide what and what is not said and how it's said. And so I want to say thank you to yourself for having people like myself on, and carrying the torch. But to all those people out there and in places like Canada where you guys are doing the right thing by your veterans, we tip the hat and we say to our friends in the North, great job. So thank you very much.
Absolutely, Sean. I love having gentlemen like yourself and just coming on and telling your story. It's fantastic.
Well, I'm happy to come on. There's so much to say. We probably only touched a half, a tenth of what needs to be talked about. But yeah, definitely happy to come on. And thank you very much for having me on. And I can't wait to hear this on your podcast. And we'll go from there.
Absolutely. This has been the Vapes4Vets podcast, brought to you by Namaste Technologies. We got a lot more interviews coming up, so tune in next time. Sean, thanks for coming on.
Awesome.
All right, take care.
Take care, sir.